Hello and welcome to www.luxurytalast.com. Today we're talking about my Vacheron and Constantin vintage watch restoration project, and the results are in. The watch has come back, and I'd like to just discuss the restoration and the purchase, just as a bit of a case study for any people who are interested in picking up a great watch at a great price. Now, the first thing is, I'd like to say that what I tend to do is I tend to have a list of online dealers who I deal with, and what I basically do is every week or so, I basically check their stock for interesting and exciting pieces. And the whole point of that is to look out for pieces which um, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So a piece that's not valued by one dealer might be valued somewhere else in the world. So it's just a matter of keeping an eye out. My tastes in watches themselves, that I'm very much a classical collector in the sense that I love the iconic pieces that brands are famous for. And even though fashions have changed, like for example, the wafer thin watches were very popular in the 50s and 60s. That was the height of sophistication and style. I very much am a fan of that type of watch, even though it's not as trendy as the big dinner plate sort of specials are now. So that's very much what I tend to do is I keep an eye out for iconic pieces. And if you have a look at my collection, you can see I've got some really iconic pieces. I've got a Patek Calatrava. I've got a Omega Speedmaster Professional Man on the Moon watch. I've got an Explorer 1. They're all iconic sort of traditional pieces, and I'm very much a conservative when it comes to my watch collecting. So I've been hanging been looking around at my watch dealers, and one of my the dealers I look at is a dealer in Melbourne called Armadale Watch Gallery. I've known Shawnee for years, and people have said to me, "Oh, geez, you can't make much money out of a dealer," but every piece I've had that I've bought from him, I've made money, and I've sold him a few pieces as well. And that's I've sold. I remember I sold him a Breguet years ago. No one wanted the Breguet. I mean, I didn't have the money to buy it for myself, and it was a lot of money at the time. He gave me a 10% earn on it, so immediately bought it, sold it to him, made 10%, which you really can't complain. So I've got a lot of respect for the guy. So I found this Vacheron 6405 on his website in the unrestored section. It looked a bit unloved. I rang him about it. Always do your homework. So with Vacheron itself, they're a brand that is famous for wafer thin watches. That's the really ultra thin type pieces. And the most important thing when you're buying a vintage watch is to make sure, this is my order of preference, is firstly, you need to make sure the case, the movement, the dial is correct for that watch. The next thing you need to do is you need to make sure there's no problems, major problems with the movement. It might need a service, that's fine, but you need to make sure the movement's basically okay. The third thing, which is really important, and I can't stress this enough, in my own collecting itself, I'm a stickler for original dials. And in vintage sports watches, the dial can have a huge effect on the value. And I, I, um, I basically, I would probably steer clear of this watch if it didn't have the original dial. So that's how important the dial is to me. I don't mind a little bit of aging, a bit of patina, but I really prefer to have the original thing there. What I look for in watches is a term called honesty, and what that means is that the watch doesn't look absolutely factory fresh. It looks like it's had a bit of wear, it was used, it may have a slight little ding somewhere, and just little signs like that. And I think honest watches are great because they tell the history of how they've come to being. And That's an important thing for myself. So with this watch itself there, I rang him and said, look, can we do a deal? Because the price, before I talked to him about price, I said, look, I'm interested in your Vacheron. The dial, is that original? In the photos he actually had a photo of the dial without the glass on, and it looked like it had a little imperfection, but um, on closer inspection, it's not anything serious at all. That's just the magnification of the photo, and so I asked him about it. He said no, it's basically good. I said to him, look, I want a watch which is the right movement, right dial, right case. I don't want something dicked around with. And he said, look, this watch here, it comes from a person who's basically the original owner of the watch, and it's basically it's all ridgy-dig. He did say to me he wasn't sure whether the crown is correct or not. He said, look, the crown may have been changed, and he said to me, look, that happened a lot on those type of 50s, 60s pieces. It probably was repaired in the 70s or 80s, and the crown. He said to me the crown may not be original, but he said to me, look, the movement, the case, the dial, that is all original to that watch when it left the Vacheron factory. So I mean that's a good big tick. So I was quite happy with that. So we then said, look, I said, look, what's the best deal you can do for me? I mean, he gives me great prices to start with. I don't need to muck around. He gave me a price, and I said sold. So then I sent the funds, and then the watch arrived. The watch arrived, and I must say, it certainly, when I first saw it, I kind of, it had a really ugly leather strap on it. The strap was a bit too fat, and it was just cheap and nasty. The watch itself, it had a bit of, when gold sits for a long time, it oxidizes a little bit, and it had a little bit of aging like that. Had a slight ding at the 8 position on the case, and I wound it up and tested it, and it was running, but it would stop after a couple of hours. So most cases that's just a sign that it needs a service. So I immediately bit the bullet and took it to my watch restoration guy. This is my sorry, I should say my watchmaker, and I instructed him not to polish it because I've got a special professional to do the polishing. But I said, look, just give it a service. He gave it a service, and in the process of servicing it, he discovered that one of the parts inside there, I think it was the clutch wheel, was playing up, and he said it had some wear on it, and he said to me with the same sentence, he said, look, I've managed to locate a part, and he charged me $50 for the part, which is an absolute miracle, because if you sent that to Vacheron for a service, you'd be looking at huge money. And although I'm not a businessman in this, you've got to be an economic realist. You send it to Vacheron, you're going to have a very huge repair. Next thing is it's going to be so slow. I'm in Australia, Vacheron's in Switzerland. It's just an absolute nightmare. It's what would happen is you'd tend to I mean, they would do a fantastic job on the restoration, but you'd overcapitalize. You'd never get your money back. And whilst this is not an exercise to make money, you've still got to be an economic realist. And I don't want to overcapitalize. I mean, if you're going to overcapitalize, you're better off to buy a perfect piece to begin with, or buy a new piece. And there's nothing to be ashamed of with that. That's just what you should do. But if you're after a vintage piece, you've got to be an economic realist. So anyhow, with the piece itself, I had the full service, and I use a wholesale watchmaker, and in my city in Brisbane, Australia, I paid about $150 with the part, which is for a mechanical watch. He charges me about $200 for an automatic type movement service and pressure test. So he gave it a really good service, and at the same time, I went shopping for a very nice leather strap. Now, the thing about these pieces, these vintage pieces, the Vacheron itself is a wafer thin watch, and it's of a different era. Modern watches themselves are big, chunky things, and the problem is, even when you buy smaller straps for your watch, the problem is the straps are made to look big and chunky because that's the new trend and fashion. So, for example, on the Vacheron, it uses 18 mil an 18 mil strap. But when you look at 18 mil straps, they're often big and chunky because that's the fashion and that. So what you want to do is you want to get a similar type of strap to what it originally would have had. And your choices are a chocolate color or a chocolate brown or a black leather. And so the hunt began. What you want to do, I've had a few vintage dress watches. I've had some Pateks before. You want to try and get as thin a strap as possible because that would complement the thin watch itself. It's in the style of the piece. And I managed to find a really nice, this is a really great brand, Bros, B-R-O-S, Italian leather strap. They're quite reasonable in price, and they make the really, I think it's just cow leather, but they make a very, very funky croc leather style pattern on it, and it's a lovely chocolatey brown. And I managed to pick one of those up. Very, the price doesn't really matter. You want it to look great. I mean that's going to really bring the piece up. So I got one of those leather straps. There again, I got it wholesale, and it cost me, I think it was under $20. But for a retail punter, that would probably be about $40-50 strap. Then I got the watch back from my watchmaker. He was very quick. He did it within a week. And the next job was to get the piece polished. Now, polishing is an art in itself. With Vacheron, it's a fine dress watch from the 50s or 60s. The Vacheron company itself is famous for its lines. If you have a look at the case on this Vacheron, it's got some really pronounced lugs on it, and they're square. So you've got a circular watch with very rectangular square type lugs. So you want to keep those lines as sharp and as pristine as possible. The other problem with this Vacheron is we've got a little ding at the 8 position. Now there's two ways you can go. You can over polish to get that ding out 100%, and you're going to take a bit off. Or you can say, okay, I acknowledge it's got a small ding, but what I'll do is I'll give it a polish, a sympathetic polish, and we'll remove some of the ding, but we'll let a little bit stay there because we don't want to detract from the watch. So that's a bit of a hard decision to make. The first impulse is always to get rid of the ding 100%, but that's often not the best way to go. So we gave it a very sympathetic polish. It's a master polisher I use. I think the polish is probably the most important thing to get this piece looking beautiful. So we got the piece polished, and the results are, the thing is, when I picked the watch up, I said, oh yeah, that's great, thank you very much. It's only when I took some high definition photos that you can see on the screen here with my macro setting on the camera that I realized what a wonderful job he'd achieved. He'd really given it a really sympathetic polish, a great polish. Now, a great polish like this is going to be expensive because the only way you can get results like this is to remove the dial and the movement from the case. There's no ifs and buts. You cannot leave it in place. You've got to remove all the parts. So that's why a professional polish is going to cost more money. But look, you look at the results here. It's sharp, it's crisp. We've got that beautiful Vacheron coin edging, and the little ding imperfection I had. Well, it's still there, but it's not as severe as it was. So that's great. And it really, after having that polished, the watch has taken on a new persona. It's got that beautiful coin edge bezel, and it's just absolutely superb, and I'm really thrilled to bits with the results. So there you have it. That's my Vacheron Concertine. It's these Vacheron, any vintage pieces, they're like buying a vintage Mercedes. There's always bits to do. I've The crown itself, um, often with most watches themselves, they still will use a gold-plated crown because the gold is too soft. So this crown here, I'm not 100% sure whether it's factory Vacheron or whether it's a crown that was fitted after. And I've seen a couple reference 6405 Vacherons on some Vacheron forums, and I've got a funny feeling this crown might be original. I'm not 100% sure, but anyhow, the crown itself, I've got to either replace it or get it gold plated because it's got a little bit of brassing on it. I think Vacheron actually use solid gold crowns. I'd have to. I'm just researching that fact at the time. And the other thing I'm trying to do is get a vintage Vacheron buckle for it. Now the problem is I need to get a really small. It tapers down to about 14 mil, so it's quite hard to get a Vacheron style buckle that would suit that. So well, that's two little things on the watch which I'm trying to work towards resolving with time. But I must say, look, the Vacheron looks absolutely gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's come out better than I expected. And at the end of the day, the Vacheron is a Geneva seal movement. It's got the K1001 movement. It's an 18 jewel movement. And for the money I've paid there, I've put about 2,500 into it. I've got a beautiful vintage dress watch. Now you might say, well, it's a bit too small, the dial, it's a bit too thin, it's not modern. Well, that can be true, but it's a beautiful representation of a 60s Vacheron, and I couldn't be more happy with it. I mean, for that sort of money, you're talking that sort of Rolex Datejust money, not solid gold Datejust, that's steel or two-tone, and I think as a dress watch, the Vacheron's it punches a hell of a lot higher than a Rolex does, and it's just a gorgeous piece. In my collection itself, I've got the gorgeous Patek Philippe in white gold, and this here is just I think a truer representation of a 50s 60s dress watch, and I'm over the moon. I hope you've enjoyed this clip. I hope the information's been useful. And please come to my free information website, www.luxurytolast.com. Thank you.